All right, let's get right into it. Picture this. It's August 14th, 2005, and high above Athens, Greece, a passenger jet is just circling and circling. For 2 straight hours, it hasn't answered a single radio call. Down on the ground, you can imagine, confusion is quickly turning to dread. Is it a hijacking? What is going on up there? Finally, the Greek Air Force scrambles F-16 fighter jets to go take a look. And what they find? Well, it's more terrifying than anyone could have possibly imagined. And that brings us to the central haunting question of Helios Flight 522. You've got a modern Boeing 737 with 121 people on board that has somehow become a ghost plane. I mean, it's flying perfectly on autopilot, everything looks fine from the outside, but inside there's just this eerie, deafening silence. So how on earth does something like this happen? So the F-16 pilots pull up alongside this airliner, and what they see is like something straight out of a nightmare. They're reporting that the passengers are just sitting there, totally motionless. Oxygen masks are dangling down, but nobody seems to be using them. They look into the cockpit, and the captain's seat is completely empty. And then they see it. A flicker of movement. A single person, who is definitely not one of the pilots, moving around inside the cockpit. But before they can even really process this bizarre, chilling scene, the unthinkable happens. The plane's left engine sputters out, starved of fuel. The jet then banks hard and starts plummeting towards the ground. Seconds later, the right engine goes quiet too. The plane slams into the mountains just north of Athens. And tragically, there are no survivors. To understand what went so horribly wrong, we've got to rewind the clock. Let's go back to that very same morning at Larnaca Airport in Cyprus. Flight 522 was just a routine summer holiday flight, you know? It was heading to Prague with a quick stop in Athens. For the 115 passengers and the 6 crew members, it was just the start of another normal day. Now, if you look at the crew on paper, these guys were pros. The captain was 59 years old with a staggering 17,000 flight hours under his belt. The first officer had 7,500. These are not rookies. But there was one little detail buried in the first officer's training records, a note that said he sometimes struggled with checklist procedures. A tiny, seemingly minor detail that was about to have the most catastrophic consequences imaginable. So the Boeing 737 takes off without a single issue. It climbs into the clear morning sky and gets clearance to head up to its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. So far, so good. Everything is going exactly by the book. The very first hint of trouble comes as the plane is climbing through 12,000 feet. All of a sudden, this alarm starts blaring in the cockpit. But it's a weird one, an alarm that the pilots would really only ever hear on the ground during their pre-flight checks. It just made no sense. And this right here, this was the fatal misunderstanding. The pilots thought they were hearing a takeoff configuration warning. That's an alarm that tells you something's not set right for takeoff, like the flaps or the brakes. But, they were already miles up in the air. The real problem, the alarm that was actually going off, was the cabin altitude warning. It was basically screaming at them that the plane was losing air pressure and everyone was running out of oxygen. From there, the whole situation just spiraled out of control fast. About 90 seconds after the alarm started, the captain called a ground engineer. But he described the wrong problem entirely, talking about equipment cooling systems. At one point, the engineer asked the most important question of the day. Is the pressurization switch set to auto? But the question was just ignored. And while this call was happening, the oxygen masks dropped down in the main cabin. Moments later, Helios Flight 522 went completely silent. So, in the aftermath of this terrible crash, investigators had the heartbreaking job of piecing this whole puzzle together. They sifted through the wreckage, they talked to the ground engineer who'd worked on the plane the night before, and that's where they found the answer. Okay, before we get to the final answer, we have to talk about something called hypoxia. It's absolutely key to understanding this story. Basically, when your brain doesn't get enough oxygen, it just stops working right. You get confused, you can't think clearly, you make bad decisions. At 34,000 feet, you have less than a minute before you pass out. And this is exactly what was happening to every single person on board that flight. And there it is, the single, incredibly simple mistake that doomed 121 people. The night before the flight, a maintenance engineer did a pressure check on the plane. And to do that test, he had to flip the cabin pressurization switch from auto over to manual. And when the test was done, he forgot to flip it back. Because that one little switch was still on manual, the plane's cabin just never pressurized as it climbed higher and higher. The air got thinner and thinner. That alarm they heard, That was the plane telling them exactly what was happening. But by then, the pilots' brains were already being starved of oxygen, and in their hypoxic state, they just couldn't figure it out. 3. That's the number you need to remember. That's how many chances the pilots had to catch this simple error. It was on their pre-flight checklist, it was on their before-taxi checklist, and it was on their after-takeoff checklist. 3 separate routine checks, and that little switch in the wrong position was missed every single time. Which brings us all the way back to that final mystery. Who was that lone figure in the cockpit, seen hours after everyone else was unconscious? And how in the world was he still awake when everyone else had already succumbed to the lack of oxygen? Well, investigators identified him. His name was Andreas Protomou, a 25-year-old flight attendant. And get this, he actually had a commercial pilot's license, though he wasn't qualified to fly a huge plane like a Boeing 737. He was the one who actually waved back at the F-16 pilot, just a final heartbreaking human connection before it was all over. So how did he stay conscious for so long? Well, investigators believe he used one of the plane's portable oxygen cylinders. They found 3 of the 4 had been used. These portable tanks provided oxygen for much longer than the drop-down masks, and it seems Andreas, and maybe 1 or 2 others, used them to stay conscious. What Andreas did in those final minutes was nothing short of heroic. He somehow got into the cockpit with both pilots slumped over and unresponsive. He sat down in the captain's chair and tried to take control. The voice recorder actually picked up 5 Mayday calls from him, but he was on the wrong radio frequency, so no one ever heard them. He was fighting to save a plane that was running out of fuel with failing engines, a plane he had no idea how to fly. It was an impossible, desperate battle that he just couldn't win. And here's maybe the most tragic part of this whole story. Even if Andreas Prodromou had been an expert 737 captain, even if he had managed to somehow land that plane, it was already too late. The amount of time everyone on board had been without sufficient oxygen meant they would have suffered irreversible brain damage. It was an unwinnable situation. But the story of Helios 522 is a catalog of errors that led to some incredibly important lessons being learned. So what changed to make sure a ghost flight like this would never happen again? Well, in the wake of this disaster, the aviation world made some serious changes. Pilot training now puts way more focus on recognizing those subtle, confusing signs of hypoxia. The warning systems themselves were redesigned to be clear, so there's no room for misinterpretation. And of course, there was a renewed, much stricter enforcement on the absolute importance of running through every single item on a checklist, every single time. In the end, the story of Helios Flight 522 is just this chilling reminder of how our most complex systems often rely on the simplest of human actions. It leaves us with this one profound question. How does something as tiny as a single switch, a single missed item on a checklist, cascade into a tragedy of this scale? It proves that in aviation, and really in so many other parts of our lives, there truly is no such thing as a small detail.